Damien Green ending that. So some families affected by the spare room subsidy or the so-called bedroom tax have been ruled unlawful and they were discriminated against by the Supreme Court. Do you still support it?
Yeah, these are very narrow cases that went all the way up to the Supreme Court because they were test cases about individuals and they are quite narrow. So the scale and extent of this is itself not as wide as was being listed. The point about this, though, was, look, this already is a policy that was part of the last government's private rented sector social housing. So if you're in the private rented sector, claiming housing benefit, you're not allowed to claim.
But I'm not asking what happened before. Do you still support the principle?
This is important. Yes, I do, because the idea of this was that you essentially bring the two areas into line. This was originally a Labour Party policy. We adopted it. We stuck with it. And what you're trying to do here is get the balance right between there are plenty of families out there, millions, on a waiting list, unable to get into housing, and there are other families who do not occupy the whole of that housing. So what you want to try and do is to, in the process of building more housing, also allocate housing in accordance with need. And that's very important.
But there have been cases of discrimination, and you accept that. You say they're narrow cases, but this was a spina bifida sufferer and a couple who look after their severely disabled grandson. Now, they won their rulings. Why were they discriminated against? I mean, their lives are already difficult as it stands, and the government made them much more difficult. They had to take their fight through the courts.
Huge amounts of money has been made to give to families to get through that process. Huge amounts, 350 million was allocated to that to allow councils to look for better circumstances for those individuals, but also at the same time, lots of allowances were made. Now, so, you know, when the court comes up with a judgment like this, the government can change elements of policy to meet that judgment, to make sure that they don't.
Should they change the policy so it doesn't affect the disabled?
Well, it doesn't. For the vast majority, it does not.
It does affect some disabled cases. Should it stop affecting people who are disabled?
But the whole question was, how and therefore do people set their own lives and get around it? And none of these cases are exactly the same. So what this case was about, do you leave that decision with local authorities with the extra money, or does government try in every single nuanced way to legislate so that it exempts different categories? If you try and do that, you end up with a massive litany of problems in the legislation, when actually giving the money to local authorities said, you can make that decision. That's what this argument was about.
And the biggest problem, Iain Duncan Smith, is that there just aren't the number of properties to move people into smaller ones. That was a massive problem, and that was which
right behind this
failed by a coalition government and a Tory government.
But, you know, successive governments for the last 25 years have not built enough properties. That is critical to this process.
And people might say you shouldn't have actually fashioned a policy until that had been solved.
That policy had to be fashioned because it actually affects people. You never talk, you know, with respect, you never talk about the millions of people who are queuing and have been ages and ages in the queues, unable to get their households. You very rarely do on these programmes.
We do, but we'll do it again.
Do, please.